Good evening, everyone. It is my very great honor to introduce Dr. Eden Nabi-Fry. Dr. Eden Nabi-Fry is a cultural historian of Middle East and Central Asia, and she is one of the curators of the traveling exhibit. Her PhD is from Columbia University, and she and her late husband, Richard Nelson Fry, have been instrumental in establishing endowments at several universities that have helped shape Assyrian studies over the last several decades, maybe even longer than that. So that has just been really significant for folks who are collecting archives and wanting to have the primary sources of history to learn more about the past. So Eden, please.
It's great to see all your faces and to be reminded by some of you of how we know each other or should know each other. So that's also a very good way of trying to convince those families, especially in Philadelphia, to do what the family in California did, to provide us with the archival materials that helped to shape this exhibit. So I have already gotten one item from a family here in Philadelphia, and we're going to try to see if we can identify who these people are, what their history was, where they came from in Iran. These are Iranian. Most of the people in Philadelphia, Assyrians in Philadelphia, came from Iran. They came either before the genocide or directly after. My family arrived in Philadelphia in 1953. And my collection of materials from my family is going to go to Harvard University, hopefully within the next 3 months, so that it can provide materials for other people who want to do research on both Iran and Middle East Christians, and of course Assyrians. I want to also call to attention the person who actually was instrumental, I mean instrumental, in locating this family. Susan, please stand up. Susan is of Norwegian background. She has no Assyrian connection at all. But we located the letters. There are about 200 letters that were sent to California. And we located those, but we didn't know who the family was. And it was Susan who sleuthed out the family. And as it happened, they lived not very far from where the letters were. They live in California. And so my co-curator, Vladi Muqaddasi, who has a wife who can cook marvelous food, so they invited them to dinner. Of course, they were smitten with the food, and they were smitten with the Assyrian community there in the San Jose area, and they provided the materials for the exhibit. So most of the materials come from that single family, 2 branches of it. And it's that sort of discovery that allows us to recreate history. Because you will note, I hope, that all of the material upstairs comes from collections in this country. There are virtually no collections left in Iran or the Middle East among Assyrians because of the genocide. They fled with only the clothes on their backs and their children, and some bread and cheese and fruit for the fleeing. So it's very important to collect materials from people that received them in this country. This is how we're getting the materials that we're getting. And we have collections at Harvard, which is quite good, a new one at UC Berkeley that is just started with 2 major collections already. So and California certainly encourages immigration materials. And there's also a collection in Chicago. So I would urge you to go through things like this in your family and see what there is. You may think that your birth certificate isn't worth much, but it tells us a lot about the community, right, Sarah? Okay. I would also like to acknowledge a woman who I have never met before who arrived, Sarah, who came from New Jersey. Sarah's great great-grandfather. Two greats, okay. Great-great-grandfather was the author of one of the first books published about Iran in this country in English. And we have his picture upstairs, a description, and the cover of the book. So there are many Assyrian histories that need to be recovered, such as that one, and I hope that we can recover your family material as well. So that's what I want to say about the exhibit. And I hope when you go upstairs, you'll be able to see something more about it. But now I want to talk about another person that I've never met before, but with whom we've been corresponding for at least 2 years. So Professor Estelami has taken an interest in the missionary archives, especially the Shed family, and of course before that, the book that he published was about other missionaries that had gone to Iran. And his work is just uncovering wonderful things that we assumed we knew, but didn't necessarily have the facts. And I'm most impressed with especially his work on Fidelia Fisk. So I don't know very much about him. He'll tell us about himself, and we will listen to what he has to say and learn a lot, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you. As you'll see, we'll draw from material that is actually a lot of the visuals are coming from the archives in this very building. But what I'll do is I'll cover kind of the connection between the missionaries and the Assyrian population in terms of where were the bridges. What you might notice is that the bridges aren't exactly the same way we thought. They were mostly in terms of bringing America to the Assyrians in Persia and where the Ottoman Empire had its ranges. So I do have a confession to make. I have quite a few, in fact, but maybe I'll start with this one. My own area of research for the past 3 decades has been consumer finances. I've been a professor of business. I graduated from Columbia, God knows, many, many years ago. And that's basically fundamentally what I have been doing in terms of my career, teaching and researching it. And aside from my teaching at Fordham, I'm the editor-in-chief of a journal called the International Journal of Bank Marketing. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning that is that my interest in this area didn't even originate from missionaries or Assyrian studies. It originated from a gentleman by the name of Morgan Schuster. He was an American banker as well. And in my study of banking practices, I was curious, well, you know, how do people make decisions not only now, but how do they make it back then? This is where you find fascinating individuals. He was a private American citizen who was hired by the Iranian, the Qajar government. This is in 1911, because he was the only person they could trust the country's finances with. And you imagine the situation today with the hostilities and the distrust and all of the tensions that are going on. You cannot possibly not inquire, well, what was this person about and what were his interactions about? He wrote a book called The Strangling of Persia, which some of you may or may not have seen. It's a fantastic book. And I use that book as a basis of trying to understand decision behavior in financial contexts in Persia, where he documented these decisions quite well. But it was through him that I found out about many other early Americans that were in Iran. And of course, I'm an Iranian myself, so the curiosity was there. And all of these pictures, just to give credit to the PHS, they are from the PHS. But basically, the discovery was that there were colonies. There were many Americans that had come before Morgan Schuster, starting in fact from 1834. And so the curiosity was, well, what were they about? Why were they there? And of course, the answer is, as you look at this, the answer is that there's a lot of documentation. One of the beauties of looking at missionary records from my side, and of course now, as Dr. Nabi mentioned, the Assyrian documentation of what happened and the family histories, is that they can come together to kind of create a better picture of what was happening. The missionaries on one side, the Assyrians on pretty much the same side, but in terms of the interactions between the same the two groups in the same environment. So the works that I've done over time, one of them was the book called The Americans of Urmia. As you see, the exhibit upstairs is mostly focusing on, in some parts focusing on Urmia. The rediscovery and I guess a rebirth, if you will, of one of the missionaries' biographies, which was written by William Shedd, but it actually never was completed. It was left by itself in 1912, and I had the honor of working with William Shedd's grandchildren to bring that back to life. It's William Shedd's writing. Howard Baskerville, which Dr. Ricks and I have been working on, and thanks to the Journal of Presbyterian History, we recently published an article on that. My latest work is on James Merrick, who is an unknown. He was a missionary that was recalled, working fundamentally with Persians, Muslim Persians, but also reallocated, if you will, to the Assyrians, but recalled in 1845. So what happened there? So that's what I'm studying. Now, one of the unique things about the common denominator between the folks that you see pictured here and what we were looking at before, and Dr. Joseph David Joseph, which is featured quite a bit in the exhibit that you see upstairs, is that they all lived, many were born, some died in a city by the name of Urmia. And you cannot really fully understand the Assyrian experience and the missionary connection to it unless you understand Urmia, in terms of what it is and where it is. And so if you look at the map of Iran, of Persia, which is pretty much the same map it was back during when the exhibit is featuring, you see all the sort of the main cities of Iran, which are more or less sheltered in the middle. They are not really, from a geographic point of view, a danger of sort of invasion from a foreign force or any kind of battle of some type that might compromise them, except for a couple of them. So you have Zahedan, you have Ahvaz. These were cities. Ahvaz was affected during the Iran-Iraq war quite a bit, but Urmia sort of sticks right out there in the corner in a very vulnerable place. It is at the border right now. Of course, it's close to the northern Iraq and eastern Turkey, but back then it was all one piece. It was Ottoman Empire, and then on top of that, of course, you have the conflicts that are happening between the Kurds and sort of other population groups, the Kurdish desire for independence. All of these dynamics were almost on steroids, if you will, when the missionaries were active there. And many of those tensions are still at play. And so you hear about them in the news. The fact that Urmia is there kind of helps us understand, well, what is so unique about both the missionaries that went there and also what the Assyrian experience had been. And so this is a close-up map. A similar map is upstairs. You can actually see that. And so you can actually see, you can actually see the city of Urmia, or the sort of the circle that you see here. The village of Karacalı is up here. This is the birthplace of Dr. Joseph David Joseph. And all of these that you are seeing here are villages, mostly Assyrian villages, but a mix of villages, in fact. And to the east is the lake, Urmia Lake, and right across within, nowadays it would be much faster, but you have basically the Ottoman border, the Turco-Persian border there. And so what I want to do is I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of the dynamics of what was this population about at the time that the missionaries went, why they went there, and how they interacted with the Assyrian population. These are the statistics when the first missionary was on the ground in 1835, and I'll speak to who he was and what he was about. But basically you're looking at a city of about 25,000 people, most of which, in fact, are not Assyrian. Most of the Assyrians would be living in what is called the Urmia field, sort of the outskirts, if you will, of Urmia, where there's a lot of agricultural fields, if you will. The Urmia plain itself had about 40,000 Assyrians. But across the border, again, going back to across the border is where you find the bulk of the Assyrian population. And that's important because from an Assyrian perspective, if you think of the Assyrian genocide and all the difficulties that the Assyrian population experienced, mostly on the Ottoman side, especially leading to World War I, there was a mass movement of the population from the Ottoman regions for safety, to Urmia. But the beauty of the area you cannot deny. The name of this city itself, if you look at the linguistic foundations of the term, is a town of water, and it is because it is near a lot of water sources. And so, again, look, this is one of them. This is one of the earliest pictures, again, from the Presbyterian Historical Society archives. And you kind of can see the lake. It's been shrinking because in recent years, because of the water flow, insufficient water flow and the evaporation of the water. It's a salt lake. And this is the way you know it's a salt lake, because here's a missionary, in this case, kind of swimming with almost no effort, and that's how you know it's a very salty lake. And there's many pictures. In fact, upstairs I noticed in the new photo album there's a couple more of similar kinds of people just enjoying the lake. This is one of the main gates of the city. Again, these are pictures that are going well over 100 years ago, and so it was fundamentally a protected city because of the barriers and walls around it. And this is again sort of the picture of the city itself. And again, it's a small city, but it's a developed city. It has its markets, it has its streets, it has its schools. It is a complete functional city. And again, this is an Assyrian family, a medical doctor and his family. And so this is an Assyrian family. I want to clarify, this is from the city. So you actually see a high degree of modernization in terms of how people are dressed and how well they read and write and interact with the outside world. And this is an Assyrian family in the mountains. And so, again, all of these we have because over time, and probably most of them come from the past 10 or 15 years, if not less, it's the families that have contributed to the archives where this material has collected. And without seeing these, without looking at these pictures, looking at the people, it's hard to kind of relate to them just by reading them. And so it kind of brings this additional dimension. So what we also know is that, of course, there was a lot of agriculture because this is a city of water, if you will. And so there's the Urmia area has, and even today, has an abundance of agricultural output. Now, the side effect of that, from both an Assyrian perspective and the perspective of the missionaries that went there, is that these agricultural water channels and the water that they hold, the water pools, would become hosts for a whole array of diseases. So malaria and cholera and things like that. And in fact, we notice in the case of Dr. Joseph, who's featured in this exhibit, the main reason he left was in fact not because of the genocide or anything like that. He left in 1903 primarily because his wife was not feeling well because of the effects of sort of the health effects of this, and he himself also suffered from malaria at different points in time. Now, what happens is when you go further west, so as you go further west, things change, and it's amazing how a few degrees of change in the incline change the dynamics of who you are, how well you can defend yourself, and how well you separate yourself from others. And so when you look at the pictures of what happens when you go farther west towards the Kurdish mountains, the angles become quite steep. And so what happens is that you have this formation of villages that are separated from each other considerably, and at the same time they are protected because of the angles. So if you're trying to defend that, it's much more difficult for anybody that's trying to attack your village to try and make it uphill. And in fact, if you've ever studied Sun Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, military strategist, one of the things he would tell you is that angle of incline is the thing you should build your entire defensive or offensive strategy around. And you see this at work here. What's amazing is the visuals of what happens when you have to go from one place to another. And so what you end up having to do is to carve in the mountain paths. Now these paths might naturally get carved because you walk through them or animals walk through them on a regular basis. But this is what you have to do at the end of the day. You have to have something like that and to get from point A to point B. And the reason why that's interesting is that, well, somebody has to make it from point A to point B. Again, this is one of the pictures from the archives, which shows, well, this is, actually, if you actually pay attention, there's a child there. So, you and I might put our kids in a child safety seat and really buckle them up to make sure they're like really, safe. Here you have, sort of the same thing, but of course going over a terrain that is much more risky. And again, in other travel images, we see much more risky situations. This particular one is a narrow passage, and you have a drop of a couple hundred feet, which nobody would want to experiment with. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is that if you look at the visuals of what it takes to even be here, as either an Assyrian or anybody that's traveling to that area, it takes a lot more guts to get from point A to point B, to even be in that environment. And it tells you a little bit about the people that were there, who were the survivors, and it really to some extent becomes a survival of the fittest. This is a missionary log from before when the Presbyterians came, and I have to make this clarification. It's a log of all the American missionaries that were in Urmia, but with one important understanding, that there were 4 missionary families like the Cones that are not listed here because they transferred over to the Presbyterian board. Now, it's not a big list, but it is a colony of some type that was in Urmia. What's interesting and what's significant is what is here in the right-hand side column. This is a tabulation of missionaries who completed their work before the Presbyterian board took over. And there are actually 3 categories. They either withdrew, they said like, this is too much, I can't handle these cliffs or all sorts of difficulties that might have been there. They may have been transferred, which is the letter T. I know it's a little difficult to see, but if you actually, and then D, the letter D, that's the 3rd category, which means that they died on the field. They died while they were actually serving. The significant thing about this is that if you actually tabulate how many Ds show up on this table, the answer is about 25%, which means that when a missionary was deployed, the risks were 25% that he or she wouldn't make it back. And that's a pretty high risk. I know as a financial services researcher, I would never sell life insurance to them. But it tells you a lot about the risks that people had to take, not just the missionaries, but also the Assyrians that were in that environment. Now, the missionaries had a choice not to go. They could withdraw from the field. The Assyrians couldn't. That was their land. And so, you sort of get an appreciation for the challenges facing the population at that point. Now, I have to, before I go too far ahead, I have to kind of disclose some clarifications on terminology. One of them is this, the term Urmia, which actually is pronounced and spelled, I think by count, if you actually take account of how many different ways people have spelled them over time, there's probably 30 different spellings. So if you see inconsistencies from one exhibit to a book, or from one book to a journal article, it's not because somebody doesn't know how to type. It's because any spelling would pass the test. So there are many different ways to spell it. The missionary records refer to the Assyrians for the most part as historians. And so if you look at the missionary history and look at how the first mission was called, it was called the mission to the Nestorians. And the reason for that is that they connected the population to the followers of Nestorius, who then in the study of history of Christianity were referred to as Nestorians. The population there never wanted to be called Nestorians, but it's because of the way the Americans viewed them that they chose to call it the mission to the Nestorians. The population generally would refer to itself as Surghai, and then as a reflection of that, in later missionary writings, we see the word Syrian, which becomes a total source of confusion unless you know what you're looking at. So you think Syrians, the country of Syria, what is it doing here in Urmia? And so it becomes a source of confusion. But again, the common sort of terminology that we've adopted today is more or less, Assyrian is the common term because it consolidates a lot of different groups from the region, and it creates a stronger sense of unity, but it is a term that actually became more prevalent through British missionaries from the 1860s, 1870s, roughly. There are two American missions, the American Board, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which was a combination of Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and the Dutch Reformed. The common denominator was that they were all Reformed Calvinists. So they saw, from a theological perspective, they saw the world in very similar ways. What happened is over time, partially because of the Civil War and other forces, the Presbyterians decided to work separately, and in fact the Dutch Reformed decided much earlier to work separately. And so much of what we have here is from the Presbyterian writings. Now, to actually kind of understand, this is a little hard to see, but there's green colored stuff, there's red colored stuff, and then there's like no colors whatsoever. So the way it works is, if you really want to understand the exhibit that's upstairs in terms of the timeline, and you want to understand also the Assyrian experience from a timeline perspective, we have almost 150-year time frame, which starts with the American Board at the top. So the green stuff is good stuff. It's like something is developing, some good things are happening. And so they work in 40-year time intervals, 40. And so we have the American Board coming in. The first American missionary to come to Urmia is Justin Perkins, arrives in Urmia in 1835, but technically is in Iran, in Persia in 1834. And so he starts this thing called the mission, and as I mentioned, they call it mission to the Nestorians. Then within a few years, we have the first, the sort of a reaction. It had nothing to do with the missionaries, but we have the first case of Kurdish independence. And in that process is the first large-scale massacre of the Assyrian population. So how large-scale is it? You recall 140,000 Assyrians in the Ottoman region. All of this is happening in the Ottoman region at that point. Bedir Khan massacred about 10,000 Assyrians. And so you're looking at, almost like, 7 or 8% of the population in a matter of a couple of years, beginning in the 1840s. And so then between the 1850s and roughly 1880, again, you have a period of development and good things happening. So the good things from an educational point of view, Urmia College, which still is around, it is still there. The Presbyterian Board takes over, and then from a church perspective, an evangelical or a Protestant church develops based on Presbyterian principles as a new choice, as an additional choice for the Assyrian population to consider. Then again, we have another case of massacres, which are not supposedly shouldn't have been focusing or affecting in any way the Assyrian population, because they were supposed to be sort of an independence aspiration that one Kurdish leader had in 1880, and it affected the missionaries quite a bit, and we'll see a little bit of that in a few minutes. But then again, you have a period of relatively quiet choices in terms of, a Russian Orthodox Church moving in, the Anglican Church moving in. So again, more choices for the Assyrian population. But when we get to the early part of the 20th century, things get ugly really fast. And so you have about a 20-year time period, including World War I, where there's a great deal of devastation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of walk you through this both a visual way and sort of ask, how did the missionaries help the Assyrians? Where were the services? Where were the kind of the exchanges that were positive in that setting? And so, in order to do that, again, in the context of the material that's in the exhibit, specifically focusing on Dr. David Joseph, he was born actually at a good time, 1868, where a lot of good things were happening. He received his theological training in Urmia College, but he made this controversial decision, which actually baffled the missionaries, to not study his advanced studies in the form of medical education in Urmia, where there was actually a medical college already in place. In fact, the very first medical college in Iran was established there. But he decided not to go there. So he came to the United States, returned to Persia for a couple of years practicing medicine, and then as things started to get ugly, but had nothing to do with that, he left because of his wife's illnesses, because of the water and things that actually we were not really sure exactly what it was, but they felt it would be better for her to be in a different climate. So they left in 1903, and from there on, you see a lot of kind of instability happening in that environment. When you do this kind of research, the sources that you have, of course, there's the printed material that you can access through what's already out there in terms of biographies. But in essence, you have to rely on archives. I have to confess that the Presbyterian Historical Society has given me unconditional support for how many times I can come here and how many hours I'm here to do research. And so you have to rely on these resources to truly understand what are people's life experiences, because that's not documented. You have to go through the archives. You have to read the letters. And you have to kind of connect the dots, because no one has done that. That's kind of the challenge here. So there's a whole array of sources that are there, but as Dr. Navy was mentioning, the question to a large extent is what's there that still needs to be retrieved. I think one of the fascinating things about the exhibit in the material that you kindly shared with me is that it gives a perspective, an Assyrian perspective, which really has not been known as much before. How the Assyrian population interacted with the missionaries. What were their impressions of the missionaries? These are things we don't know. And of course, the struggles and challenges that they had to deal with in their lives, both before the genocide and after the genocide. So that is what is so critical in terms of having an exhibit like this, and to try and understand where the opportunities are for a better understanding. You can never talk about the Assyrian experience and the missionary experience without talking about Justin Perkins. He was the first missionary to have arrived there. And the reason why it's important to kind of recognize him is that one of the biggest things he did, which he may not get enough credit for, is that he created a written form for the modern Syriac language. So the key point is that the Syriac language that is used in the church at that point in time was Old Syriac, which is something that the population in Urmia would not fully understand, because through the years, through interacting with the Kurds and the Persians and Arabs and so on and so forth, the language had changed. So how you spell, what are the grammatical principles, how do you even write, because there was no written form of it. He created that language in that sense, in terms of the written form. And so again, in terms of personal sacrifices, lost 6 of his 7 children. The 7th one he decided to bring back to America, who actually wrote eventually a biography of him. And then you see innovations. I mean, talk about innovative thinking. You're going into an environment where you have thousands, tens of thousands of people that you were trying to educate, put through medical, provide medical help for, and things like that. Specifically with respect to education, he was the first in Iran to deploy the Lancastrian method of teaching. And it sounds intuitive, until you actually I have to show you the visuals of how this works. So the idea is that you have a teacher who teaches a couple of students, brings them to sufficient level of mastery so that they can actually begin to teach others. Not at a master level, but sufficiently that they can actually learn. And so those 3 teachers become teachers to others, and then again those become teachers to others. So you have this literally an exponential growth in the capacity of the education system. You can start with as few as 3 students, and within a couple of months you are looking at a much larger body of students that you can actually serve. And the mission records show this. So they had in 1836, this is a year after Perkins had arrived, there were 3 village schools. There was a male seminary, so 44 students, and again around 90-something students in the village schools. You fast forward by just 5 years, and now you're looking at orders of magnitude in terms of growth. You have now a female seminary. You have more than 400 students across different schools, both in villages and in the city. And then again, you move forward. In 1879, the college is established, and I'll speak to that in a minute. And then also the recognition that you can only teach, theology is one thing, which was mostly what the early education system was focusing on. The idea of, training ministers so that they can go into, different villages. But then you also want to teach the ability to earn a living. So woodworking, metalworking, agriculture. So industrial education began. And so right before things got really uncomfortable, with the upcoming World War I events, you have a relatively large school system. You're looking at what you can see there, 55 village schools, looking at almost in total, including the male and female seminary, 2,000 students being educated. So that's one of the bridges. In fact, I would argue it's the most important bridge, because the idea is that you're bringing Western education into an environment where, in fact, the rest of Persia was not getting as much of it. And this is all of it funded primarily through the missionary organization itself. So it was fundamentally supported through the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions. These are pictures of the village schools, and you can sort of see this is a village in the Urmia plain. This is a village school in further into the mountains. It is organized. I mean, they seem like well-behaved kids. So you sort of see testimony that it is a truly functioning education system. This is the Fisk Seminary. So it's a female seminary. It's named after Fidelia Fisk, who was a pioneering female missionary that was deployed in the 1830s, late 1840s until the 1850s. And then talk about exponential growth. So look at this and versus this. And this is in 1865. This is all of the graduates of the Fisk Seminary at that point in time. This is a sort of a 50-year anniversary, if you will, of the mission at that point in time. And so the importance of female education, which was important to the Presbyterians, kind of passed on directly to what was being done in Urmia. This is a male school in the village of Seir, which is south of Urmia, which then later moved closer to the city. This building, interestingly, became the headquarters of the Ottomans when they invaded Urmia, and then when they were removed from Urmia, it became the headquarters of Near East Relief. So a lot of the relief work that was done after World War I was stationed from there. Now, one of the other innovations that the missionaries brought, which had significant bridge building effect, if you will, for the Assyrian population, was the building of what's called a college compound. It's a massive compound that they purchased outright from someone, in fact a female owner, a landowner that sold it to them. And it actually already had a fortress type structure to it. And you can see it had these watchtowers on the side. And it was called, the locals for a long time called it Kala for two reasons. Number one, the missionaries called it the college compound, so it sounded like Kala sounded, similar to that, but fundamentally because it had a fortress-like appearance. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning that is that that fortress-like appearance became an important factor when World War I broke out, because these walls and the fortress and sort of setup that it has became a source of protection, a way of protecting the population, the Assyrian population. Now, what is interesting is that when this college was built, alongside it was the medical college. It is Iran's first medical college. So even if you look at medical history, the history of medicine in Iran, even today, it would be acknowledged as Iran's first modern medical school. And it was built by Dr. Cochrane. And here's the interesting thing. He says, this is actually a quote directly from him, that it's basically a mission of teaching the medical sciences to the young men. Now, they didn't have female students at that point in time. Young men of this nation here, right here in their homes. The idea was, therefore, to not send Assyrians or anyone else that wants to study, it could have been non-Assyrian Persians, abroad, but to make sure that they actually receive that education there. And the reason that's important is that you're trying to control how far away this education goes, in the sense that if you're educating the population but you're sending them abroad, then there's no guarantee that they'll come back. That's the reality of it. And in fact, one of the challenges we know that Dr. Joseph featured up in the exhibit upstairs experienced was that when he himself decided that he wants to go abroad, there was no support for him to go abroad. So the bridge was really intended, when we talk about an Assyrian bridge, it was intended to bring the education to Urmia, to that location itself. Now, one of the other interesting things is that it was called the Westminster Hospital of Urmia because the bulk of the funding for this hospital, this medical college, came from the Westminster Church of Buffalo. That building that you're looking at right now is still operational. It is still on the Urmia University campus. It is not used as a hospital. It is used as an administrative building. And the church that sponsored it, which was the Westminster Church of Buffalo, that same building in that same year is still standing. And I think it's fascinating, the connection between the two cities and the two people. They're still there. These buildings are still there. In fact, the entire college is still there. And so if you look at these are old pictures. This is from the 1880s. Again, from the archives. All of these are from the archives here. This is from probably around 1912 or 1913, and this is from around probably 1930 or so, early 1930s. And you can see they have these trees, these sycamore trees that have grown over time. Those trees are still standing. So if you look at a satellite image of Urmia University, those trees that you saw that are dating back 100 and something years, are still there. And those streets, the avenues, if you will, that you see in these pictures are still there. And so it just sort of shows you that bridge is, that bridge is still functioning. It is still a campus, it is still a college, it is still a university that is run from that setting. Now, one of the other things that the missionaries had done was to bring printing. So think about this. If you have the education system, you're educating thousands over time, but you have to have printed material for everyone to use, to read, whether it's mathematics or whether it's theology or whatever it happens to be, literature. So that started early on. So in 1840, a missionary by the name of Edward Brett actually came to Persia. He was an abolitionist who almost lost his life here, but he didn't. So he it was a turning point for him. He went to Persia. The printing press that he brought, imagine, we looked at the pictures of how difficult it is to get from point A to point B. Imagine transporting a printing press. So they actually had to manufacture a printing press specifically for Persia, for that mission station, so that it would be broken into little pieces that could be put on the back of very large animals, not just a little animal, like a really large animal, and then brought in pieces to Urmia. But the volume of printing fascinates me. On average, you're looking at 1 million printed pages a year. It's massive. And so the idea is that if you look at the history of this, so they started in 1841. One of the other pioneering things that they did was a publication called The Rays of Light, which is an Assyrian, written by Assyrians, edited by Assyrians as well as the missionaries. It was the first periodical in Iran. There was nothing like it in all of Iran before that. And so you can sort of look at the statistics by the year where World War I, by 1918, they had, well, the end of World War I, there was at that time about 188 titles had been published. Not that all were done in 1918, but in terms of the accumulation of all of that. And in 1919, again, the aftermath of World War I, the printing press was destroyed. But again, you see innovation there. It was not the first printing press in Persia, but it was pioneering in many other ways, including the volume. This is actually a picture of that press itself. Another bridge that was built was on the religious side and the formation of the Syrian Evangelical Church, which followed very much a Presbyterian model. And it was an evolutionary process. The original instructions to the American missionaries, back when the American board had sent the original missionaries in the 1830s, was not to form a new church. Do not disturb the existing, the old Nestorian church, as they used to call it. But eventually, over time, the Assyrians, a certain population, the subpopulation of the Assyrians, attended the religious ceremonies of the Americans, and by 1871, a separate church was formed. And over time, you're looking at numbers of around 2,000 to 4,000 in terms of the membership. So it's a significant number, but in fact, as we'll see in a few minutes, it was challenged almost immediately because other missionaries came into that space, especially the Russian Orthodox missionaries, for political reasons to a large extent, entered that space. But the structure of that church follows very much a Presbyterian model. So you have presbyteries, you have synods, multiple synods that are mostly the first three were located in Persia, and then there were two that were located in the Ottoman field. But again, they became inaccessible because of the inaccessibility across the Turco-Persian border. But they followed a very similar model. You had annual meetings. You have, in their case, you also had a legal board that provided for legal protection for the Assyrians. So if there were disputes between, especially between church members, the legal board of that church would try and settle it within the church itself and not delegate it to a Persian government church, fundamentally because it was felt that it's probably more well or fairly treated if it is internally dealt with. Now, the years leading to World War I, we see an acceleration of interest from the Assyrian population to move to the United States. This is even before the events of Sappho and the Assyrian genocide. So in the missionary writings, including what I had mentioned, if you reread what I mentioned when the foundation of the medical school was there in the quote from Dr. Cochrane. The idea is we would like the Assyrian population to be educated here. And in fact, in the missionary writings, we see this. This is from the Presbyterian Board annual report from 1903, and you can sort of see a concern that the Assyrians that are being educated are leaving, or they're coming to America. And we see this as well in the writings, the diary of Dr. Joseph, in the sense that he felt that the reception wasn't as great when he came here. There was not as much support. Now, of course, things change after World War I. After the genocide, the dynamics change. But the idea was to make sure that the Assyrian population, where they are supported right there, and you don't lose all of the experts and the highly educated people that you develop through your education system to outside sources. But this is 1903, and I'm not going to go through this. A lot of reds, actually, unfortunately. A lot of things that happen actually right around that time. In 1903, what happens is an Assyrian by the name of Mushi Daniel, who was highly educated, educated in the United States, in fact, but returned to the Urmia region, was killed by a Kurdish tribesman. Just because he didn't want to give away his watch. That's it, for no other reason. And then the missionaries got involved. This again is another part where you see that bridge building, where the idea is that you value that life and you seek justice for the loss of that life to a point where you put your foot down and you say that is not acceptable. So the person who got involved, the missionary who got involved, was Dr. Cochrane, and he pushed the Persian government to bring this person, the killer, his name is Qajar, to bring him back to justice. And you're looking at actually a tribal situation where this person crosses the Turco-Persian border, difficult to arrest, but not impossible. And the feeling was that there's no effort being made by the Persian government to arrest him. What happened is that the supporters or the allies of Qajar found out that Cochrane is really pushing for his arrest, and they attempted to assassinate him, but in the process they assassinated the wrong person. And the person that they assassinated was another missionary by the name of Benjamin Woods Lavery. And this is not documented here, and we don't have enough time to cover this, but it brought the missionaries to a point where they pressed the U.S. State Department to push the Persian, this is the Qajar government, to deploy an expeditionary force to arrest these assassins and Qajar, which they eventually did, but in that process, not only because of that, but because of other things, the entire area, the Turco-Persian border, became highly unstable. And we have visuals of that. So this is the visuals of Lavery's funeral. And again, you see that, remember that gate I showed you? You can see that in the background. It was of significant importance both to the Assyrians and to the missionaries. I mean, this really hurt. And you see, you're looking at 5 or 6 years of engagement of the U.S. State Department to kind of bring this to some form of closure. Alongside that, when the Persian expeditionary force was deployed, you also had the Turkish forces beginning to cross the border, and as a result, you had a great deal of instability. This is a photograph actually taken by William Shedd, who was one of the biggest contributors, if you will, in terms of his writings and his materials to the Presbyterian Historical Society. Picture that he took of Ottoman soldiers that had crossed the border. And around that time, you see this Russian movement to that region in order to kind of push back the Ottomans. And alongside that, you have the case of Howard Baskerville, who died in 1909, not in Urmia, in Tabriz, but again, Tabriz was occupied by the Russians shortly after that. So a lot of these things, kind of you begin to see them in pictures in different ways. Morgan Schuster, the first person I talked about, in fact had to leave for that same Russian pressure. The Russians moving, threatening actually to take over the capital, Tehran, unless he leaves. So here you have one of the most honest people coming to become the treasurer of the country. Can you imagine that? Becoming kind of like the central bank, if you will. He would, kind of decide whether it's right for someone to get paid or whether a government agency should get paid. And within less than 1 year, under Russian pressure, he has to leave. And so he had to leave. This is a picture of actually his last a few minutes in Tehran, and then boarding the Shah's car. This is a Turco-Persian commission that is kind of creating that border, and then eventually things get really ugly. So I'm not going to go into the dynamics of how things evolved here, but you're looking at Russian movements, Russians being in Urmia up until January 1 of 1915. Then, without any notice to anyone in Urmia, they leave, and then the Ottomans move in, and then they stay there till May of 1915. So you have this movement, massive movement. The areas that you're looking at are two population groups. These are Assyrian villages moving north with the Russians, and you see some of that in the exhibit here. And then you have those that are closer to Urmia moving into Urmia, closer to the mission, and in fact protected again by, as you can see, the fortress-like structure. This is inside that fortress, if you will, that they are protected. And then again, you have a period of relative peace, but then a vacuum because the Russians again have to leave. And then you have civil war that takes place inside Urmia, and eventually by August of that year, you have again another Ottoman invasion of Urmia. At which point you're looking at around 80,000 Assyrians fleeing. So you have a flight of 80,000 Assyrians from Urmia down south towards Hamadan, and so the picture that you're looking at is in fact a photo of that flight. So 80,000 people fleeing over a course of about 4 weeks on foot, with roughly around 4,000 people dying in that process. Among them was William Shedd, who died as a result of cholera, not because of the violence. Most of the deaths were happening because of that. And then everyone settled. Most of the population settled in a refugee camp in north of Baghdad in Iraq. So what happened in terms of the mission station, just to give you a feel for the timing, by the time the missionaries they left in 1919, the mission had to come to some form of closure, but they tried to come back. So by 1922, there was again some mission activity, and by 1934, Reza Shah was the king at that point in time. The dynasty had changed, if you will. Decided that there were to be no more missionaries there, and also that there were to be, in fact, the mission schools had to downsize to a large extent. In fact, in Urmia, they were no longer to be. And so the mission came to an end. If you think about this, Justin Perkins was on the ground in 1834, and the mission came to an end in 1934. So you have this almost perfect 100-year time period in which all of the mission work was there, and then it was no longer there. And so it came to closure. But what is interesting is that it's not the end of the story, because the mission closed in Urmia. You can sort of see the Urmia mission. It closed. There was no longer a mission after that. But by then, a whole bunch of other mission stations had opened. The one in Tabriz, where Baskerville was located, and then a whole array of other ones. And in fact, if you notice, they're all located to the north of the country, and that's because there was an understanding with the Anglicans that the Anglicans would take the southern portions of Iran, and the Presbyterians would take the northern portions, although they were cooperating. So there were American hospitals, for example, operating in southern Iran, but the mission stations were kept to the north. Presbyterian mission stations were kept to the north. Now, there's still, things that remain from the missionaries and the Assyrian experience. So the house where, for example, Joseph Cochrane lived is still there on the campus of Urmia University. It is protected, in fact, as a historical site, and it is recognized because of him. So, the university there recognizes him as the founder of modern medicine in Iran, and has recognized it. And there's articles actually that have been published out of Iran in recognition of that. The university, can you see those trees? They're still there. The cemetery where the missionaries were is still there, although this is an old picture. It is now walled and more difficult to access, but that cemetery is still there. And what's more important is that the remainders of what they did in the form of photographs, in the form of the letters, correspondences, they are still here. And so, the idea is that we can still revisit those experiences. What you see to the left is Dr. Joseph David Joseph and part of his family. And what you see on the right is Dr. Shedd, William Shedd, and his family. These pictures are within a few years of each other. But what's significant about them is a discovery of material. So, the discovery of Dr. Joseph's diary, I think it was in 2020, right in the heat of COVID. The discovery of William Shedd's writing about his father, the biography, was also at the same time. So unless we make this effort as individuals to kind of find these pieces of history, they will be lost forever. My biggest fear, I have some material I've collected over the years. My biggest fear is that my kids are going to sell it in a garage sale, when I'm not around anymore. And so it's quite significant from a learning perspective. The way I look at it is, from my perspective, looking at the missionaries, these were the first Americans to go to Iran. Looking at their experience and their interactions with Iranians, whether they were Assyrians or Muslims or any other background, I want to understand what those experiences were like, because back then there were no military interests, there were no financial interests, there were no economic forces. So it gives you this unique ability to get to the bottom of things. As two people, how were we? How did we interact? And it's the same thing with the Assyrian experience. What was that life experience like? What were those interactions like? And one of the most interesting things that I've found in the archives here is that, now it's difficult to see, this is actually a Christmas card, and it's kind of very sort of symbolic at this point in time, because we're right in the middle between the Persian New Year and the Assyrian New Year, this week or two we have. But this is actually a Christmas card that was given to the Shedd family. You can see January 8th of 1910. And somebody made this. It is actually written by someone probably who is an Azeri Turkish, a Muslim probably. And it's written, the Persian is not perfect and the English is also not perfect, but it is the ultimate bridge between the different cultures. And quite frankly, unless you see something like this, you don't realize that people did get along much better back then, and there was a lot more, positive exchanges. And we learn from that, because, that's, those are the moments in history that we need to be able to kind of recover and revive through whatever it is that we do, whether it's attending talks like this, which I'm very thankful for everybody attending, of course, or whether it's through the research that we do, or how it is that we discover these amazing things. Thank you.